Part 1 of the Legends of the Jews, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 4, David. David's birth and descent. David, the elect of God, was descended from a family which itself belonged to the elect of Israel. Those ancestors of his who are enumerated in the Bible by name are all of them men of distinguished excellence. Besides, David was a descendant of Miriam, the sister of Moses, and so the strain of royal aristocracy was reinforced by the priestly aristocracy. Nor was David the first of his family to occupy the throne of a ruler. His great-grandfather Boaz was one and the same person with Ibzan, the judge of Bethlehem. Othniel, too, the first judge in Israel after the death of Joshua, and Caleb, the brother of Othniel, were connected with David's family. As examples of piety and virtue, David had his grandfather and more particularly his father before him. His grandfather's whole life was a continuous service of God, whence his name Obed, the servant, and his father Jesse was one of the greatest scholars of his time, and one of the four who died wholly untainted by sin. If God had not ordained death for all the descendants of our first parents after their fall, Jesse would have continued to live forever. As it was, he died at the age of 400, and then a violent death by the hand of the Moabite king, in whose care David, trusting in the ties of kinship between the Moabites and the seed of Ruth, left his family when he was fleeing before Saul. Jesse's piety will not go unrewarded. In the Messianic time, he will be one of the 8 princes to rule over the world. In spite of his piety, Jesse was not always proof against temptation. One of his slaves caught his fancy, and he would have entered into illicit relations with her had his wife Nazbat, the daughter of Adiel, not frustrated the plan. She disguised herself as the slave, and Jesse, deceived by the ruse, met his own wife. The child born by Nazbat was given out as the son of the freed slave, so that the father might not discover the deception practiced upon him. This child was David. In a measure, David was indebted for his life to Adam. At first, only 3 hours of existence had been allotted to him. When God caused all future generations to pass in review before Adam, he besought God to give David 70 of the 1,000 years destined for him. A deed of gift signed by God and the angel Metatron was drawn up. 70 years were legally conveyed from Adam to David, and in accordance with Adam's wishes, beauty, dominion, and poetical gift went with them. Anointed King. Beauty and talent, Adam's gifts to David, did not shield their possessor against hardship. As the supposed son of a slave, he was banished from association with his brothers, and his days were passed in the desert tending his father's sheep. It was his shepherd life that prepared him for his later exalted position. With gentle consideration he led the flocks entrusted to him. The young lambs he guided to pastures of tender grass. The patches of less juicy herbs he reserved for the sheep, and the full-grown sturdy rams were given the tough weeds for food. Then God said, "David knows how to tend sheep, therefore he shall be the shepherd of my flock, Israel." In the solitude of the desert, David had opportunities of displaying his extraordinary physical strength. One day he slew 4 lions and 3 bears, though he had no weapons. His most serious adventure was with the reem. David encountered the mammoth beast asleep, and taking it for a mountain, he began to ascend it. Suddenly the reem awoke, and David found himself high up in the air on its horns. He vowed, if he were rescued, to build a temple to God 100 ells in height, as high as the horns of the reem. Thereupon God sent a lion. The king of beasts inspired even the reem with awe. The reem prostrated himself, and David could easily descend from his perch. At that moment a deer appeared, the lion pursued after him, and David was saved from the lion as well as the reem. He continued to lead the life of a shepherd until at the age of 28 he was anointed king by Samuel, who was taught by a special revelation that the despised youngest son of Jesse was to be king. Samuel's first charge had been to anoint one of the sons of Jesse, but he was not told which one. When he saw the oldest, Eliab, he thought him the king of God's choice. God had allowed him to be deceived in order to punish Samuel for his excessive self-consciousness in calling himself the seer. It was thus proved to him that he could not foresee all things. However, Samuel's error was pardonable. God's first choice had rested upon Eliab. Only on account of his violent nature, his swiftness to anger against David, the position destined for him was transferred to his youngest brother. Eliab was in a sense compensated by seeing his daughter become the wife of Rehoboam. Thus he too enjoys the distinction of being among the ancestors of the Judaic kings, and Samuel's vision of Eliab as king was not wholly false. The election of David was obvious from what happened with the holy oil with which he was anointed. When Samuel had tried to pour the oil on David's brothers, it had remained in the horn, but at David's approach it flowed of its own accord and poured itself out over him. The drops on his garments changed into diamonds and pearls, and after the act of anointing him, the horn was as full as before. The amazement was great that the son of a slave should be made king. Then the wife of Jesse revealed her secret and declared herself the mother of David. The anointing of David was for a time kept a secret, but its effect appeared in the gift of prophecy, which manifested itself in David and in his extraordinary spiritual development. His new accomplishments naturally earned envy for him. None was more bitterly jealous than Doeg, the greatest scholar of his time. When he heard that Saul was about to have David come to court as his attendant, Doeg began to praise David excessively, with the purpose of arousing the king's jealousy and making David hateful in his eyes. He succeeded, yet Saul did not relinquish his plan of having David at court. David had become known to Saul in his youth, and at that time the king had conceived great admiration for him. The occasion was one on which David had shown cleverness as well as love of justice. A rich woman had had to leave her home temporarily. She could not carry her fortune with her, nor did she wish to entrust it to anyone. She adopted the device of hiding her gold in honey jars, and these she deposited with a neighbor. Accidentally, he discovered what was in the jars, and he abstracted the gold. On her return, the woman received her vessels, but the gold concealed in them was gone. She had no evidence to bring up against her faithless neighbor, and the court dismissed her complaint. She appealed to the king, but he was equally powerless to help. When the woman came out of the palace of the king, David was playing with his companions. Seeing her dejection, he demanded an audience of the king, that truth might prevail. The king authorized him to do as he saw fit. David ordered the honey jars to be broken, and 2 coins were found to adhere to the inner side of the vessels. The thief had overlooked them, and they proved his dishonesty. Encounter with Goliath. David was not long permitted to enjoy the ease of life at court. The aggressive manner assumed by Goliath drove him to the front. It was a curious chance that designated David to be the slayer of Goliath, who was allied with him by the ties of blood. Goliath, it will be remembered, was the son of the Moabitess Orpah, the sister-in-law of David's ancestress Ruth, and her sister as well, both having been the daughters of the Moabite king Eglon. David and Goliath differed as widely as their granddames, for in contrast to Ruth, the pious religious Jewess, Orpah had led a life of unspeakable infamy. Her son Goliath was jeered at as the son of 100 fathers and one mother. But God lets naught go unrewarded, even in the wicked. In return for the 40 steps Orpah had accompanied her mother-in-law Naomi, Goliath the Philistine, her son, was permitted to display his strength and skill for 40 days. And in return for the 4 tears Orpah had shed on parting from her mother-in-law, she was privileged to give birth to 4 giant sons. Of the 4, Goliath was the strongest and greatest. What the Scriptures tell about him is but a small fraction of what might have been told. The Scriptures refrain intentionally from expatiating upon the prowess of the miscreant, nor do they tell how Goliath, impious as he was, dared challenge the God of Israel to combat with him, and how he tried by every means in his power to hinder the Israelites in their divine worship. Morning and evening he would appear in the camp at the very time when the Israelites were preparing to say the Shema. All the more cause, then, for David to hate Goliath and determine to annihilate him. His father encouraged him to oppose Goliath, for he considered it David's duty to protect Saul, the Benjamite, against the giant, as Judah, his ancestor, had in ancient days pledged himself for the safety of Benjamin, the ancestor of Saul. For Goliath was intent upon doing away with Saul. His grievance against him was that once, when in a skirmish between the Philistines and the Israelites, Goliath had succeeded in capturing the holy tables of the law, Saul had wrested them from the giant. In consequence of his malady, Saul could not venture to cross swords with Goliath, and he accepted David's offer to enter into combat in his place. David put on Saul's armor, and when it appeared that the armor of the powerfully built king fitted the erstwhile slender youth, Saul recognized that David had been predestined for the serious task he was about to undertake. But at the same time, David's miraculous transformation did not fail to arouse his jealousy. David, for this reason, declined to array himself as a warrior for his contest with Goliath. He wanted to meet him as a simple shepherd. 5 pebbles came to David of their own accord, and when he touched them, they all turned into 1 pebble. The 5 pebbles stood for God, the 3 patriarchs, and Aaron. Hophni and Phinehas, the descendants of the last, had only a short time before been killed by Goliath. Scarcely did David begin to move toward Goliath when the giant became conscious of the magic power of the youth. The evil eye David cast on his opponent sufficed to afflict him with leprosy, and in the very same instant he was rooted to the ground, unable to move. Goliath was so confused by his impotence that he scarcely knew what he was saying, and he uttered the foolish threat that he would give David's flesh to the cattle of the field, as though cattle ate flesh. One can see, David said to himself, that he is crazy, and there can be no doubt he is doomed. Sure of victory, David retorted that he would cast the carcass of the Philistine to the fowls of the air. At the mention of fowls, Goliath raised his eyes skyward to see whether there were any birds about. The upward motion of his head pushed his visor slightly away from his forehead, and in that instant the pebble aimed by David struck him on the exposed spot. An angel descended and cast him to the ground, face downward, so that the mouth that had blasphemed God might be choked with earth. He fell in such wise that the image of Dagon, which he wore on his breast, touched the ground, and his head came to lie between the feet of David, who now had no difficulty in dispatching him. Goliath was encased from top to toe in several suits of armor, and David did not know how to remove them and cut off the head of the giant. At this juncture Uriah the Hittite offered him his services, but under the condition that David secure him an Israelitish wife. David accepted the condition, and Uriah in turn showed him how the various suits of armor were fastened together at the heels of the giant's feet. David's victory naturally added fuel to the fire of Saul's jealousy. Saul sent Abner, his general, to make inquiry whether David, who he knew was of the tribe of Judah, belonged to the clan of the Perez or to the clan of the Zerah. In the former case, his suspicion that David was destined for kingship would be confirmed. Doeg, David's enemy from of old, observed that David, being the descendant of the Moabites, Ruth, did not even belong to the Jewish communion, and Saul need entertain no fears from that quarter. A lively discussion arose between Abner and Doeg as to whether the law in Deuteronomy regarding Moabites affected women as well as men. Doeg, an expert dialectician, brilliantly refuted all of Abner's arguments in favor of the admission of Moabitish women. Samuel's authority had to be appealed to in order to establish for all times the correctness of Abner's view. Indeed, the dispute could be settled only by recourse to threats of violence. Ithra, the father of Amasa, in Arab fashion, for which reason he was sometimes called the Ishmaelite, threatened to hew down any one with his sword who refused to accept Samuel's interpretation of the law, that male Moabites and male Ammonites are forever excluded from the congregation of Israel, but not Moabite and Ammonite women. Pursued by Saul. As God stood by David in his duel with Goliath, so he stood by him in many other of his difficulties. Often when he thought all hope lost, the arm of God suddenly succored him, and in unexpected ways, not only bringing relief, but also conveying instruction on God's wise and just guidance of the world. David once said to God, "The world is entirely beautiful and good, with the one exception of insanity. What use does the world derive from a lunatic who runs hither and thither, tears his clothes, and is pursued by a mob of hooting children?" "Verily, a time will come," said God in reply, "when thou wilt supplicate me to afflict thee with madness." Now it happened when David, on his flight before Saul, came to Achish, the king of the Philistines, who lived in Gath, that the brothers of Goliath formed the heathen king's bodyguard, and they demanded that their brother's murderer be executed. Achish, though a heathen, was pious, for which reason he is called Abimelech in the Psalms, after the king of Gerar, who also was noted for piety. He therefore sought to pacify David's enemies. He called their attention to the fact that Goliath had been the one to challenge the Jews to combat, and it was meet, therefore, that he should be left to bear the consequences. The brothers rejoined, if that view prevailed, then Achish would have to give up his throne to David, for according to the conditions of the combat, the victor was to have dominion over the vanquished as his servants. In his distress, David besought God to let him appear a madman in the eyes of Achish and his court. God granted his prayer. As the wife and daughter of the Philistine king were both bereft of reason, we can understand his exclamation, "Do I lack madmen, that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence?" Thus it was that David was rescued. Thereupon he composed the psalm beginning with the words, "I will bless the Lord at all times," which includes even the time of lunacy. On another occasion, David expressed his doubt of God's wisdom in having formed such apparently useless creatures as spiders are. They do nothing but spin a web that has no value. He was to have striking proof that even a spider's web may serve an important purpose. On one occasion he had taken refuge in a cave, and Saul and his attendants, in pursuit of him, were about to enter and seek him there. But God sent a spider to weave its web across the opening, and Saul told his men to desist from fruitless search in the cave, for the spider's web was undeniable proof that no one had passed through its entrance. Similarly, when David became indebted to one of them for his life, he was cured of his scorn for wasps. He had thought them good for nothing but to breed maggots. David once surprised Saul and his attendants while they were fast asleep in their camp, and he resolved to carry off, as proof of his magnanimity, the cruse that stood before the feet of the giant Abner, who, like the rest, was sleeping. Fortunately, his knees were drawn up so that David could carry out his intention unhindered. But as David was retiring with the cruse, Abner stretched out his feet and pinned David down as with two solid pillars. His life would have been forfeit if a wasp had not stung Abner, who mechanically in his sleep moved his feet and released David. There were still other miracles that happened to David in his flight. Once, when Saul and his men compassed David round about, an angel appeared and summoned him home to repulse the raid of the Philistines upon the land. Saul gave up the pursuit of David, but only after a majority had so decided, for some had been of the opinion that the seizure of David was quite as important as the repulse of the Philistines. Again, in his battle with the Amalekites, David enjoyed direct intervention from above. Lightning and flashes and sheets illumined the dark night, so enabling him to carry on the struggle. Wars. David's first thought after ascending the throne was to wrest Jerusalem, sacred since the days of Adam, Noah, and Abraham, from the grasp of the heathen. The plan was not easy of execution for various reasons. The Jebusites, the possessors of Jerusalem, were the posterity of those sons of Heth who had ceded the cave of Machpelah to Abraham only on condition that their descendants should never be forcibly dispossessed of their capital city, Jerusalem. In perpetuation of this agreement between Abraham and the sons of Heth, monuments of brass were erected, and when David approached Jerusalem with hostile intent, the Jebusites pointed to Abraham's promise engraven upon them and still plainly to be read. They maintained that before David could take the city, which they had surrounded with a high wall, he would have to destroy the monuments. Joab devised a plan of getting into Jerusalem. He set up a tall cypress tree near the wall, bent it downward, and standing on David's head, he grasped the very tip of the tree. When the tree rebounded, Joab sat high above the wall and could jump down upon it. Once in the city, he destroyed the monuments and possessed himself of Jerusalem. For David, a miracle had happened. The wall had lowered itself before him so that he could walk into the city without difficulty. David, however, was not desirous of using forcible means. He therefore offered the Jebusites 600 shekels, 50 shekels for each Israelitish tribe. The Jebusites accepted the money and gave David a bill of sale. Jerusalem having been acquired, David had to prepare for war with the Philistines, in which the king gave proof at once of his heroic courage and his unshakable trust in God. The latter quality he displayed signally in the battle that took place in the valley of the giants. God had commanded David not to attack the host of the Philistines until he heard the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees. God desired to pass judgment upon the tutelary angels of the heathen before surrendering the heathen themselves to the pious, and the motion of the tops of the trees was to indicate that the battle could proceed. The enemy advanced until there were but 4 ells between them and the Israelites. The latter were about to throw themselves against the Philistines, but David restrained them, saying, God forbade me to attack the Philistines before the tops of the trees begin to move. If we transgress God's command, we shall certainly die. If we delay, it is probable that we shall be killed by the Philistines, but at least we shall die as pious men that keep God's command. Above all, let us have confidence in God. Scarcely had he ended his speech when the tops of the trees rustled, and David made a successful assault upon the Philistines. Whereupon God said to the angels, who were constantly questioning him as to why he had taken the royal dignity from Saul and given it to David, see the difference between Saul and David. Of David's other campaigns, the most notable is his war with Shobak the Aramian, whom he conquered in spite of his gigantic size and strength. Shobak was very tall as a dovecote, and one look at him sufficed to strike terror to the heart of the beholder. The Aramean general indulged in the belief that David would treat the Syrians gently on account of the monument still in existence at that time, which Jacob and Laban had erected on the frontier between Palestine and Aram, as a sign of their covenant that neither they nor their descendants should wage war with each other. But David destroyed the monument. Similarly, the Philistines had placed trust in a relic from Isaac, the bridle of a mule, which the patriarch had given to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, as a pledge of the covenant between Israel and his people. David took it from them by force. However, David was as just as he was bold. Disregard of the covenants made by the patriarchs was far removed from his thoughts. Indeed, before departing for the wars with the Arameans and the Philistines, he had charged the Sanhedrin to investigate carefully the claims of the two nations. The claims of the Philistines were shown to be utterly unfounded. In no sense were they the descendants of those Philistines who had concluded a treaty with Isaac. They had emigrated from Cyprus at a much later date. The Arameans, on the other hand, had forfeited their claims upon considerate treatment, because under the Aramean Balaam, and later again in the time of Othniel, under their king Cushan-Rishathaim, they had attacked and made war upon the Israelites. Ahithophel. Among David's courtiers and attendants, a prominent place is occupied by his counselor Ahithophel, with whom the king was connected by family ties, Bathsheba being his granddaughter. Ahithophel's wisdom was supernatural, for his counsels always coincided with the oracles rendered by the Urim and Thummim, and great as was his wisdom, it was equaled by his scholarship. Therefore David did not hesitate to submit himself to his instruction, even though Ahithophel was a very young man at the time of his death, not more than 33 years old. The one thing lacking in him was sincere piety, and this it was that proved his undoing in the end, for it induced him to take part in Absalom's rebellion against David. Thus he forfeited even his share in the world to come. To this dire course of action he was misled by astrologic and other signs, which he interpreted as prophecies of his own kingship, when in reality they pointed to the royal destiny of his granddaughter Bathsheba. Possessed by his erroneous belief, he cunningly urged Absalom to commit an unheard-of crime. Thus Absalom would profit nothing by his rebellion, for though he accomplished his father's ruin, he would yet be held to account and condemned to death for his violation of family purity, and the way to the throne would be clear for Ahithophel, the great sage in Israel. The relation between David and Ahithophel had been somewhat strained even before Absalom's rebellion. Ahithophel's feelings had been hurt by his being passed over at the time when David, shortly after ascending the throne, invested on a single day no less than 90,000 functionaries with positions. On that day a remarkable incident occurred. When the ark was to be brought up from Jeba to Jerusalem, the priests who attempted to take hold of it were raised up in the air and thrown violently to the ground. In his despair, the king turned for advice to Ahithophel, who retorted mockingly, "Ask thy wise men, whom thou hast but now installed in office." It was only when David uttered a curse on him who knows a remedy and withholds it from the sufferer, that Ahithophel advised that a sacrifice should be offered at every step taken by the priests. Although the measure proved efficacious and no further disaster occurred in connection with the ark, yet Ahithophel's words had been insincere. He knew the real reason of the misadventure and concealed it from the king. Instead of following the law of having the ark carried on the shoulders of priests, David had had it put on a wagon, and so incurred the wrath of God. Ahithophel's hostility toward David showed itself also on the following occasion. When David was digging the foundations of the temple, a shard was found at a depth of 1,500 cubits. David was about to lift it when the shard exclaimed, "Thou canst not do it." "Why not?" asked David. "Because I rest upon the abyss." "Since when?" "Since the hour in which the voice of God was heard to utter the words from Sinai, 'I am the Lord thy God,' causing the earth to quake and sink into the abyss. I lie here to cover up the abyss." Nevertheless, David lifted the shard, and the waters of the abyss rose and threatened to flood the earth. Ahithophel was standing by, and he thought to himself, "Now David will meet with his death, and I shall be king." Just then David said, "Whoever knows how to stem the tide of waters and fails to do it, will one day throttle himself." Thereupon Ahithophel had the name of God inscribed upon the shard, and the shard thrown into the abyss. The waters at once commenced to subside, but they sank to so great a depth that David feared the earth might lose her moisture, and he began to sing the 15 songs of ascents to bring the waters up again. Nevertheless, David's curse was realized. Ahithophel ended his days by hanging himself. His last will contained the following 3 rules of conduct. 1. Refrain from doing aught against a favorite of fortune. 2. Take heed not to rise up against the royal house of David. 3. If the feast of Pentecost falls on a sunny day, then sow wheat. Posterity has been favored with the knowledge of but a small part of Ahithophel's wisdom, and that little through 2 widely different sources, through Socrates, who was his disciple, and through a fortune book written by him. Joab. Joab the warrior was a contrast to Ahithophel in every essential. He was David's right hand. It was said, if Joab had not been there to conduct his wars, David would not have had leisure to devote himself to the study of the Torah. He was the model of a true Jewish hero, distinguished at the same time for his learning, piety, and goodness. His house stood wide open for all comers, and the campaigns which he undertook redounded invariably to the benefit of the people. They were indebted to him for luxuries even, and more than that, he took thought for the welfare of scholars, he himself being the president of the Sanhedrin. It interested Joab to analyze the character of men and their opinions. When he heard King David's words, "Like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him," he expressed his astonishment that the comparison should be made with the love of a father for a child, and not with the love of a mother. Mother love, as a rule, is considered the stronger and the more self-sacrificing. He made up his mind to keep his eyes open and observe whether David's idea was borne out by facts. On one of his journeys he happened into the house of a poor old man who had 12 children, all of whom the father supported, however meagerly, with the toil of his own hands. Joab proposed that he sell him one of the 12 children. He would thus be relieved of the care of one, and the selling price could be applied to the better support of the rest. The good father rejected the proposition brusquely. Then Joab approached the mother, offering her 100 gold denarii for one of the children. At first she resisted the temptation, but finally she yielded. When the father returned in the evening, he cut the bread, as was his wont, into 14 pieces, for himself, his wife, and his 12 children. In allotting the portions, he missed a child, and insisted upon being told its fate. The mother confessed what had happened during his absence. He neither ate nor drank, and next morning he set out, firmly resolved to return the money to Joab, and to slay him if he should refuse to surrender the child. After much parleying, and after the father had threatened him with death, Joab yielded the child to the old man with the exclamation, "Yes, David was right when he compared God's love for men to a father's love for his child. This poor fellow, who has 12 children to support, was prepared to fight me to the death for one of them, which the mother, who calmly stayed at home, had sold to me for a price." Among all the heroic achievements of Joab, the most remarkable is the taking of the Amalekite capital. For 6 months the flower of the Israelitish army, 12,000 in number, under the leadership of Joab, had been besieging the capital city of the Amalekites without result. The soldiers made representations to their general that it would be well for them to return home to their wives and children. Joab urged that this not only would earn for them contempt and derision, but also would invite new danger. The heathen would be encouraged to unite against the Israelites. He proposed that they hurl him into the city by means of a sling, and then wait 40 days. If at the end of this period they saw blood flow from the gates of the fortress, it should be a sign to them that he was still alive. His plan was executed. Joab took with him 1,000 pieces of money and his sword. When he was cast from the sling, he fell into the courtyard of a widow, whose daughter caught him up. In a little while he regained consciousness. He pretended to be an Amalekite taken prisoner by the Israelites and thrown into the city by his captors, who thus wished to inflict death. As he was provided with money, which he dispensed lavishly among his entertainers, he was received kindly and was given the Amalekite garb. So apparelled, he ventured after 10 days on a tour of inspection through the city, which he found to be of enormous size. His first errand was to an armorer to have him mend his sword, which had been broken by his fall. When the artisan scanned Joab's weapon, he started back. He had never seen a sword like it. He forged a new one, which snapped in two almost at once when Joab grasped it firmly. So it happened with a second sword and with a third. Finally he succeeded in fashioning one that was acceptable. Joab asked the smith whom he would like him to slay with the sword, and the reply was, Joab, the general of the Israelitish king. I am he, said Joab. And when the smith, in astonishment, turned to look at him, Joab ran him through so skillfully that the victim had no realization of what was happening. Thereupon he hewed down 500 Amalekite warriors whom he met on his way, and not one escaped to betray him. The rumor arose that Asmodeus, the king of demons, was raging among the inhabitants of the city and slaying them in large numbers. After another period of 10 days, which he spent in retirement with his hosts, Joab sallied forth a second time and caused such bloodshed among the Amalekites that his gory weapon clave to his hand, and his right hand lost all power of independent motion. It could be made to move only in a piece with his arm. He hastened to his lodging place to apply hot water to his hand and free it from the sword. On his way thither, the woman who had caught him up when he fell into the city called to him, Thou eatest and drinkest with us, yet thou slayest our warriors. Seeing himself betrayed, he could not but kill the woman. Scarcely had his sword touched her when it was separated from his hand, and his hand could move freely, for the dead woman had been with child, and the blood of the unborn babe loosed the sword. After Joab had slain thousands, the Israelites without, at the very moment when they were beginning to mourn their general as dead, saw blood issue from the city, and joyfully they cried out with one accord, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Joab mounted a high tower and in stentorian tones shouted, The Lord will not forsake his people. Inspired with high and daring courage, the Israelites demanded permission to assault the city and capture it. As Joab turned to descend from the tower, he noticed that 6 verses of a psalm were inscribed on his foot, the first verse running thus, The Lord answers thee in the day of trouble. The name of the God of Jacob is thy defense. Later, David added 3 verses and completed the psalm. Thereupon the Israelites took the Amalekite capital, destroyed the heathen temples in the city, and slew all its inhabitants, except the king, whom, with his crown of pure gold on his head, they brought before David. Chapter 4, Part 2, David's piety and his sin. Neither his great achievements in war, nor his remarkable good fortune moved David from his pious ways, or in aught changed his mode of life. Even after he became king, he sat at the feet of his teachers, Ira the Jairite, and Mephibosheth. To the latter he always submitted his decisions on religious questions to make sure that they were in accordance with law. Whatever leisure time his royal duties afforded him, he spent in study and prayer. He contented himself with 60 breaths of sleep. At midnight the strings of his harp, which were made of the gut of the ram sacrificed by Abraham on Mount Moriah, began to vibrate. The sound they emitted awakened David, and he would arise at once to devote himself to the study of the Torah. Besides study, the composition of psalms naturally claimed a goodly portion of his time. Pride filled his heart when he had completed the Psalter, and he exclaimed, "O Lord of the world, is there another creature in the universe who, like me, proclaims thy praise?" A frog came up to the king and said, "Be not so proud. I have composed more psalms than thou, and besides, every psalm my mouth has uttered I have accompanied with 3,000 parables." And truly, if David indulged in conceit, it was only for a moment. As a rule, he was the exemplar of modesty. The coins which were stamped by him bore a shepherd's crook and pouch on the obverse, and on the reverse the Tower of David. In other respects, too, his bearing was humble, as though he were still the shepherd and not the king. His great piety invested his prayer with such efficacy that he could bring things in heaven down to earth. It is natural that so godly a king should have used the first respite granted by his wars to carry out his design of erecting a house of worship to God. But in the very night in which David conceived the plan of building the temple, God said to Nathan the prophet, "Hasten to David. I know him to be a man with whom execution follows fast upon the heels of thought, and I should not like him to hire laborers for the temple work, and then, disappointed, complain of me. I furthermore know him to be a man who obligates himself by vows to do good deeds, and I desire to spare him the embarrassment of having to apply to the Sanhedrin for absolution from his vow." When David heard Nathan's message for him, he began to tremble, and he said, "Ah, verily, God hath found me unworthy to erect his sanctuary." But God replied with these words, "Nay, the blood shed by thee I consider as sacrificial blood, but I do not care to have thee build the temple, because then it would be eternal and indestructible." "But that would be excellent," said David. Whereupon the reply was vouchsafed him, "I foresee that Israel will commit sins. I shall wreak my wrath upon the temple, and Israel will be saved from annihilation. However, thy good intentions shall receive their due reward. The temple, though it be built by Solomon, shall be called thine." David's thinking and planning were wholly given to what is good and noble. He is one of the few pious men over whom the evil inclination had no power. By nature he was not disposed to commit such evil doing as his relation to Bathsheba involved. God himself brought him to his crime, that he might say to other sinners, "Go to David and learn how to repent." Nor indeed may David be charged with gross murder and adultery. There were extenuating circumstances. In those days it was customary for warriors to give their wives bills of divorce, which were to have validity only if the soldier husbands did not return at the end of the campaign. Uriah having fallen in battle, Bathsheba was a regularly divorced woman. As for the death of her husband, it cannot be laid entirely at David's door, for Uriah had incurred the death penalty by his refusal to take his ease in his own house, according to the king's bidding. Moreover, from the first, Bathsheba had been destined by God for David, but by way of punishment for having lightly promised Uriah the Hittite, an Israelitish woman to wife, in return for his aid in unfastening the armor of the prostrate Goliath, the king had to undergo bitter trials before he won her. Furthermore, the Bathsheba episode was a punishment for David's excessive self-consciousness. He had fairly besought God to lead him into temptation, that he might give proof of his constancy. It came about thus. He once complained to God, "O Lord of the world, why do people say God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, and why not God of David?" The answer came, "Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were tried by me, but thou hast not yet been proved." David entreated, "Then examine me, O Lord, and try me." And God said, "I shall prove thee, and I shall even grant thee what I did not grant the patriarchs. I shall tell thee beforehand that thou wilt fall into temptation through a woman." Once Satan appeared to him in the shape of a bird. David threw a dart at him. Instead of striking Satan, it glanced off and broke a wicker screen which hid Bathsheba combing her hair. The sight of her aroused passion in the king. David realized his transgression, and for 22 years he was a penitent. Daily he wept a whole hour and ate his bread with ashes, but he had to undergo still heavier penance. For a half year he suffered with leprosy, and even the Sanhedrin, which usually was in close personal attendance upon him, had to leave him. He lived not only in physical, but also in spiritual isolation, for the Shekinah departed from him during that time. Absalom's rebellion. Of all the punishments, however, inflicted upon David, none was so severe as the rebellion of his own son. Absalom was of such gigantic proportions that a man who was himself of extraordinary size, standing in the eye socket of his skull, sank in down to his nose. As for his marvelous hair, the account of it in the Bible does not convey a notion of its abundance. Absalom had taken the vow of a Nazarite. As his vow was for life, and because the growth of his hair was particularly heavy, the law permitted him to clip it slightly every week. It was of this small quantity that the weight amounted to 200 shekels. Absalom arranged for his audacious rebellion with great cunning. He secured a letter from his royal father, empowering him to select 2 elders for his suite in every town he visited. With this document he traveled through the whole of Palestine. In each town he went to the 2 most distinguished men, and invited them to accompany him, at the same time showing them what his father had written, and assuring them that they had been chosen by him because he had a particular affection for them. So he succeeded in gathering the presidents of 200 courts about him. This having been accomplished, he arranged a large banquet, at which he seated one of his emissaries between every 2 of his guests, for the purpose of winning them over to his cause. The plan did not succeed wholly, for though the elders of the town stood by Absalom, in their hearts they hoped for David's victory. The knowledge that a part of Absalom's following sided with him in secret, that though he was pursued by his son, his friends remained true to him, somewhat consoled David in his distress. He thought that in these circumstances, if the worst came to the worst, Absalom would at least feel pity for him. At first, however, the despair of David knew no bounds. He was on the point of worshipping an idol, when his friend Hushai the Archite, approaching him, saying, "The people will wonder that such a king should serve idols." David replied, "Should a king such as I am be killed by his own son? It is better for me to serve idols than that God should be held responsible for my misfortune, and his name thus be desecrated." Hushai reproached him, "Why didst thou marry a captive?" "There is no wrong in that," replied David. "It is permitted according to the law." Thereupon Hushai, "But thou didst disregard the connection between the passage permitting it and the one that follows almost immediately after it in the Scriptures, dealing with the disobedient and rebellious son, the natural issue of such a marriage." Hushai was not the only faithful friend and adherent David had. Some came to his rescue unexpectedly, as, for instance, Shobi, the son of Nahash. who is identical with the Ammonite king Hanun, the enemy of David at first, and later his ally. Barzillai, another one of his friends in need, also surprised him by his loyalty, for on the whole his moral attitude was not the highest conceivable. Absalom's end was beset with terrors. When he was caught in the branches of the oak tree, he was about to sever his hair with a sword stroke, but suddenly he saw hell yawning beneath him, and he preferred to hang in the tree to throwing himself into the abyss alive. Absalom's crime was indeed of a nature to deserve the supreme torture, for which reason he is one of the few Jews who have no portion in the world to come. His abode is in hell, where he is charged with the control of 10 heathen nations in the second division. Whenever the avenging angels sit in judgment on the nations, they desire to visit punishment on Absalom too, but each time a heavenly voice is heard to call out, "Do not chastise him, do not burn him. He is an Israelite, the son of my servant David." Whereupon Absalom is set upon his throne and is accorded the treatment due to a king. That the extreme penalties of hell were thus averted from him was on account of David's eightfold repetition of his son's name in his lament over him. Besides, David's intercession had the effect of reattaching Absalom's severed head to his body. At his death, Absalom was childless, for all his children, his 3 sons and his daughter, died before him as a punishment for his having set fire to a field of grain belonging to Joab. David's atonement. All these sufferings did not suffice to atone for David's sin. God once said to him, "How much longer shall this sin be hidden in thy hand and remain unatoned? On thy account the priestly city of Nob was destroyed. On thy account Doeg the Edomite was cast out of the communion of the pious. And on thy account Saul and his 3 sons were slain. What dost thou desire now? That thy house should perish, or that thou thyself shouldst be delivered into the hands of thine enemies?" David chose the latter doom. It happened one day when he was hunting, Satan, in the guise of a deer, enticed him further and further into the very territory of the Philistines, where he was recognized by Ishbi the giant, the brother of Goliath, his adversary. Desirous of avenging his brother, he seized David and cast him into a winepress, where the king would have suffered a torturous end, if by a miracle the earth beneath him had not begun to sink, and so saved him from instantaneous death. His plight, however, remained desperate, and it required a second miracle to rescue him. In that hour, Abishai, the cousin of David, was preparing for the advent of the Sabbath, for the king's misfortune happened on Friday, as the Sabbath was about to come in. When Abishai poured out water to wash himself, he suddenly caught sight of drops of blood in it. Then he was startled by a dove that came to him plucking out her plumes and moaning and wailing. Abishai exclaimed, "The dove is the symbol of the people of Israel. It cannot be but that David, the king of Israel, is in distress." Not finding the king at home, he was confirmed in his fears, and he determined to go on a search for David on the swiftest animal at his command, the king's own saddle beast. But first he had to obtain the permission of the sages to mount the animal ridden by the king, for the law forbids a subject to avail himself of things set aside for the personal use of a king. Only the impending danger could justify the exception made in this case. Scarcely had Abishai mounted the king's animal when he found himself in the land of the Philistines, for the earth had contracted miraculously. He met Orpah, the mother of the 4 giant sons. She was about to kill him, but he anticipated the blow and slew her. Ishbi, seeing that he now had 2 opponents, stuck his lance into the ground and hurled David up in the air, in the expectation that when he fell he would be transfixed by the lance. At that moment Abishai appeared, and by pronouncing the name of God, he kept David suspended twixt heaven and earth. Abishai questioned David how such evil plight had overtaken him, and David told him of his conversation with God and how he himself had chosen to fall into the hands of the enemy rather than permit the ruin of his house. Abishai replied, "Reverse thy prayer, plead for thyself and not for thy descendants. Let thy children sell wax, and do thou not afflict thyself about their destiny." The two men joined their prayers and pleaded with God to avert David's threatening doom. Abishai again uttered the name of God, and David dropped to earth uninjured. Now both of them ran away swiftly, pursued by Ishbi. When the giant heard of his mother's death, his strength forsook him, and he was slain by David and Abishai. Visitations. Among the sorrows of David are the visitations that came upon Palestine during his reign, and he felt them all the more as he had incurred them through his own fault. There was first the famine, which was so desolating that it is counted among the 10 severest that are to happen from the time of Adam to the time of the Messiah. During the first year that it prevailed, David had an investigation set on foot to discover whether idolatry was practiced in the land and was keeping back the rain. His suspicion proved groundless. The second year he looked into the moral conditions of his realm, for lewdness can bring about the same punishment as idolatry. Again he was proved wrong. The third year he turned his attention to the administration of charity. Perhaps the people had incurred guilt in this respect, for abuses in this department also were visited with the punishment of famine. Again his search was fruitless, and he turned to God to inquire of him the cause of the public distress. God's reply was not Saul a king anointed with holy oil? Did he not abolish idolatry? Is he not the companion of Samuel in paradise? Yet while you all dwell in the land of Israel, he is outside of the land. David, accompanied by the scholars and the nobles of his kingdom, at once repaired to Jabesh Gilead, disinterred the remains of Saul and Jonathan, and in solemn procession bore them through the whole land of Israel to the inheritance of the tribe of Benjamin. There they were buried. The tributes of affection paid by the people of Israel to its dead king aroused the compassion of God, and the famine came to an end. The sin against Saul was now absolved, but there still remained Saul's own guilt in his dealings with the Gibeonites, who charged him with having killed 7 of their number. David asked God why he had punished his people on account of proselytes. God's answer to him was, "If thou dost not bring near them that are far off, thou wilt remove them that are near by." To satisfy their vengeful feelings, the Gibeonites demanded the life of 7 members of Saul's family. David sought to mollify them, representing to them that they would derive no benefit from the death of their victims, and offering them silver and gold instead. But though David treated with each one of them individually, the Gibeonites were relentless. When he realized their hardness of heart, he cried out, "3 qualities God gave unto Israel. They are compassionate, chaste, and gracious in the service of their fellow men. The first of these qualities the Gibeonites do not possess, and therefore they must be excluded from communion with Israel." The 7 descendants of Saul to be surrendered to the Gibeonites were determined by letting all his posterity pass by the ark of the law. Those who were arrested before it were the designated victims. Mephibosheth would have been one of the unfortunates, had he not been permitted to pass by unchecked in answer to the prayer of David, to whom he was dear, not only as the son of his friend Jonathan, but also as the teacher who instructed him in the Torah. The cruel fate that befell the descendants of Saul had a wholesome effect. All the heathen who saw and heard exclaimed, "There is no God like unto the God of Israel. There is no nation like unto the nation of Israel. The wrong inflicted upon wretched proselytes has been expiated by the sons of kings." So great was the enthusiasm among the heathen over this manifestation of the Jewish sense of justice that 150,000 of them were converted to Judaism. As for David, his wrong in connection with the famine lay in his not having applied his private wealth to the amelioration of the people's suffering. When David returned victorious from the combat with Goliath, the women of Israel gave him their gold and silver ornaments. He put them aside for use in building the temple, and even during the 3 years' famine, this fund was not touched. God said, "Thou didst refrain from rescuing human beings from death in order to save thy money for the temple. Verily, the temple shall not be built by thee, but by Solomon." David is still more blameworthy on account of the census which he took of the Israelites in defiance of the law in the Pentateuch. When he was charged by the king with the task of numbering the people, Joab used every effort to turn him away from his intention, but in vain. Incensed, David said, "Either thou art king and I am the general, or I am king and thou art the general." Joab had no choice but to obey. He selected the tribe of Gad as the first to be counted because he thought that the Gadites, independent and self-willed, would hinder the execution of the royal order, and David would be forced to give up his plan of taking a census. The Gadites disappointed the expectations of Joab, and he betook himself to the tribe of Dan, hoping that if God's punishment descended, it would strike the idolatrous Danites. Disliking his mission as he did, Joab spent 9 months in executing it, though he might have dispatched it in a much shorter time. Nor did he carry out the king's orders to the letter. He himself warned the people of the census. If he saw the father of a family of 5 sons, he would bid him conceal a few of them. Following the example set by Moses, he omitted the Levites from the enumeration, likewise the tribe of Benjamin, because he entertained particularly grave apprehensions in behalf of this greatly decimated tribe. In the end, David was not informed of the actual number obtained. Joab made 2 lists, intending to give the king a partial list if he found that he had no suspicion of the ruse. The prophet Gad came to David and gave him the choice of famine, oppression by enemies, or the plague as the penalty for the heavy crime of popular census taking. David was in the position of a sick man who is asked whether he prefers to be buried next to his father or next to his mother. The king considered, "If I choose the calamities of war, the people will say he cares little, he has his warriors to look to. If I choose famine, they will say he cares little, he has his riches to look to. I shall choose the plague, whose scourge strikes all alike." Although the plague raged but a very short time, it claimed a large number of victims. The most serious loss was the death of Abishai, whose piety and learning made him the counterpoise of a host of 75,000. David raised his eyes on high, and he saw the sins of Israel heaped up from earth to heaven. In the same moment an angel descended and slew his 4 sons, the prophet Gad and the elders who accompanied him. David's terror at this sight, which was but increased when the angel wiped his dripping sword on the king's garments, settled in his limbs, and from that day on they never ceased to tremble. The death of David. David once besought God to tell him when he would die. His petition was not granted, for God has ordained that no man shall foreknow his end. One thing, however, was revealed to David, that his death would occur at the age of 70 on the Sabbath day. David desired that he might be permitted to die on Friday. This wish, too, was denied him because God said that he delighted more in one day passed by David in the study of the Torah than in 1,000 holocausts offered by Solomon in the temple. Then David petitioned that life might be vouchsafed him until Sunday. This too was refused, because God said it would be an infringement of the rights of Solomon, for one reign may not overlap by a hairbreadth the time assigned to another. Thereafter David spent every Sabbath exclusively in the study of the Torah, in order to secure himself against the angel of death, who has no power to slay a man while he is occupied with the fulfillment of God's commandments. The angel of death had to resort to cunning to gain possession of David. One Sabbath day, which happened to be also the Pentecost holiday, the king was absorbed in study, when he heard a sound in the garden. He rose and descended the stairway leading from his palace to the garden to discover the cause of the noise. No sooner had he set foot on the steps than they tumbled in, and David was killed. The angel of death had caused the noise in order to utilize the moment when David should interrupt his study. The king's corpse could not be moved on the Sabbath, which was painful to those with him, as it was lying exposed to the rays of the sun. So Solomon summoned several eagles, and they stood guard over the body, shading it with their outstretched pinions. David in paradise. The death of David did not mean the end of his glory and grandeur. It merely caused a change of scene. In the heavenly realm, as on earth, David ranks among the first. The crown upon his head outshines all others, and whenever he moves out of paradise to present himself before God, suns, stars, angels, seraphim, and other holy beings run to meet him. In the heavenly courtroom, a throne of fire of gigantic dimensions is erected for him directly opposite to the throne of God. Seated on this throne and surrounded by the kings of the house of David and other Israelitish kings, he intones wondrously beautiful psalms. At the end, he always cites the verse, "The Lord reigns forever and ever," to which the archangel Metatron and those with him reply, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." This is the signal for the holy Hayat and heaven and earth to join in with praise. Finally, the kings of the house of David sing the verse, "And the Lord shall be king over all. In that day shall the Lord be one, and his name one." The greatest distinction to be accorded David is reserved for the judgment day, when God will prepare a great banquet in paradise for all the righteous. At David's petition, God himself will be present at the banquet and will sit on his throne, opposite to which David's throne will be placed. At the end of the banquet, God will pass the wine cup over which grace is said to Abraham with the words, "Pronounce the blessing over the wine, thou who art the father of the pious of the world." Abraham will reply, "I am not worthy to pronounce the blessing, for I am the father also of the Ishmaelites who kindle God's wrath." God will then turn to Isaac, "Say the blessing, for thou wert bound upon the altar as a sacrifice." "I am not worthy," he will reply, "for the children of my son Esau destroyed the temple." Then to Jacob, "Do thou speak the blessing, thou whose children were blameless." Jacob also will decline the honor on the ground that he was married to two sisters at the same time, which later was strictly prohibited by the Torah. God will then turn to Moses, "Say the blessing, for thou didst receive the law and didst fulfill its precepts." Moses will answer, "I am not worthy to do it, seeing that I was not found worthy to enter the Holy Land." God will next offer the honor to Joshua, who both led Israel into the Holy Land and fulfilled the commandments of the law. He too will refuse to pronounce the blessing because he was not found worthy to bring forth a son. Finally, God will turn to David with the words, "Take the cup and say the blessing, thou the sweetest singer in Israel and Israel's king." And David will reply, "Yes, I will pronounce the blessing, for I am worthy of the honor." Then God will take the Torah and read various passages from it, and David will recite a psalm in which both the pious in paradise and the wicked in hell will join with a loud Amen. Thereupon God will send his angels to lead the wicked from hell to paradise. The family of David. David had 6 wives, including Michal, the daughter of Saul, who is called by the pet name Eglah, calfkin in the list given in the Bible narrative. Michal was of entrancing beauty and at the same time the model of a loving wife. Not only did she save David out of the hands of her father, but also when Saul, as her father and her king, commanded her to marry another man, she acquiesced only apparently. She entered into a mock marriage in order not to arouse the anger of Saul, who had annulled her union with David on grounds which he thought legal. Michal was good as well as beautiful. She showed such extraordinary kindness to the orphan children of her sister Merab that the Bible speaks of the 5 sons of Michal whom she bore to Abdiel. Abdiel, however, was her brother-in-law and not her husband, but she had raised his children, treating them as though they were her own. Michal was no less a model of piety. Although the law exempted her as a woman from the duty, still she executed the commandment of using phylacteries. In spite of all these virtues, she was severely punished by God for her scorn of David, whom she reproached with lack of dignity when he had in mind only to do honor to God. Long she remained childless, and at last, when she was blessed with a child, she lost her own life in giving birth to it. But the most important among the wives of David was Abigail, in whom beauty, wisdom, and prophetical gifts were joined. With Sarah, Rahab, and Esther, she forms the quartet of the most beautiful women in history. She was so bewitching that passion was aroused in men by the mere thought of her. Her cleverness showed itself during her first meeting with David, when, though anxious about the life of her husband Nabal, she still, with the utmost tranquillity, put a ritual question to him in his rage. He refused to answer it, because he said it was a question to be investigated by day, not by night. Thereupon Abigail interposed, that sentence of death likewise may be passed upon a man only during the day. Even if David's judgment were right, the law required him to wait until daybreak to execute it upon Nabal. David's objection that a rebel like Nabal had no claim upon due process of law she overruled with the words, "Saul is still alive, and thou art not yet acknowledged king by the world." Her charm would have made David her captive on this occasion, if her moral strength had not kept him in check. By means of the expression, "and this shall not be unto thee," she made him understand that the day had not yet arrived, but that it would come, when a woman, Bathsheba, would play a disastrous part in his life. Thus she manifested her gift of prophecy. Not even Abigail was free from the feminine weakness of coquetry. The words, "Remember thine handmaid," should never have been uttered by her. As a married woman, she should not have sought to direct the attention of a man to herself. In the women's paradise, she supervises the 5th of the 7 divisions into which it is divided, and her domain adjoins that of the wives of the patriarchs, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. Among the sons of David, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, must be mentioned, particularly the pretender to the throne. The 50 men whom he prepared to run before him had fitted themselves for the place of heralds by cutting out their spleen and the flesh of the soles of their feet. That Adonijah was not designated for the royal dignity was made manifest by the fact that the crown of David did not fit him. This crown had the remarkable peculiarity of always fitting the legitimate king of the house of David. Chileab was a son worthy of his mother Abigail. The meaning of his name is "like the father," which had been given him because of his striking resemblance to David in appearance, a circumstance that silenced the talk against David's all too hasty marriage with the widow of Nabal. Intellectually, too, Chileab testified to David's paternity. In fact, he excelled his father in learning, as he did even the teacher of David, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. On account of his piety, he is one of the few who have entered paradise alive. Tamar cannot be called one of the children of David because she was born before her mother's conversion to Judaism. Consequently, her relation to Amnon is not quite of the grave nature it would have been had they been sister and brother in the strict sense of the terms. To the immediate household of David belonged 400 young squires, the sons of women taken captive in battle. They wore their hair in heathen fashion, and sitting in golden chariots, they formed the vanguard of the army and terrified the enemy by their appearance. His tomb. When David was buried, Solomon put abundant treasures into his tomb. 1,300 years later, the high priest Hyrcanus took 1,000 talents of the money secreted there to use it in preventing the siege of Jerusalem by the Greek king Antiochus. King Herod also abstracted great sums, but none of the marauders could penetrate to the resting place of the kings. Next to David, his successors were interred, for it was sunk into the earth so skillfully that it could not be found. Once on a time, a Moslem pasha visited the mausoleum, and as he was looking through the window in it, a weapon of his ornamented with diamonds and pearls dropped into the tomb. A Mohammedan was lowered through the window to fetch the weapon. When he was drawn up again, he was dead, and 3 other Mohammedans who tried to enter in the same way met the fate of their comrade. At the instigation of the Qadi, the Pasha informed the Rabbi of Jerusalem that the Jews would be held responsible for the restoration of the weapon. The Rabbi ordered a 3 days' fast to be spent in prayer. Then lots were cast to designate the messenger who was to be charged with the perilous errand. The lot fell upon the beadle of the synagogue, a pious and upright man. He secured the weapon and returned it to the Pasha, who manifested his gratitude by kindly treatment of the Jews thereafter. The beadle later told his adventures in the tomb to the Hakam Bashi. When he had descended, there suddenly appeared before him an old man of dignified appearance, and handed him what he was seeking. Another miraculous tale concerning the tomb of David runs as follows. A poor but very pious Jewish washerwoman was once persuaded by the keeper of the tomb to enter it. Hardly was she within when the man nailed up the entrance and ran to the Qadi to inform him that a Jewess had gone in. Incensed, the Qadi hastened to the spot with the intention of having the woman burnt for her presumptuousness. In her terror, the poor creature had begun to weep and implore God for help. Suddenly a flood of light illumined the dark tomb, and a venerable old man took her by the hand and led her downward under the earth until she reached the open. There he parted from her with the words, "Hasten homeward, and let none know that thou wert away from thy house." The Qadi had the tomb and its surroundings thoroughly searched by his bailiffs, but not a trace of the woman could be discovered, although the keeper again and again swore by the prophet that the woman had entered. Now the messengers whom the Qadi had sent to the house of the woman returned, and reported they had found her washing busily, and greatly astonished at their question whether she had been at the tomb of David. The Qadi accordingly decided that for his false statements and his perjury, the keeper must die the very death intended for the innocent woman, and so he was burnt. The people of Jerusalem suspected a miracle, but the woman did not divulge her secret until a few hours before her death. She told her story, and then bequeathed her possessions to the congregation under the condition that a scholar recite Kaddish for her on each anniversary of her death.